I would like to welcome everybody here for the third Digital Competitiveness Summit. We're going to do this, of course, virtually today. I'm extremely proud. Today is a big day. A lot of things are happening. Of course, the IMD Global Digital Competitiveness Ranking is out, but also Digital Switzerland had its general assembly just 2 hours ago. I would like to thank EPFL and I would like to thank IMD for being partner of this wonderful event today. I would like to welcome all of you and thank you for participating. We will have a couple of hundred leaders of innovation, digitization and transformation with us today. And I would like to thank all the speakers, and it's extremely high-end speakers, wonderful leaders that we have with us today. We will hear Mariana Mazzucato talking to us in a panel. Mariana directs the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the University College in London. We will have Martin Vetterli in a second, the president of EPFL. We will have Arturo Breeze, who is leading the world-renowned IMD World Competitiveness Center. And we will have, of course, Jean-François Manzoni, the president of IMD, and on the panel, together with Mariana, Klaus Hommels, one of the most successful and one of the biggest investors based in Europe. Now, having said this, let's kick it off for the next 60 or 70 minutes. And I have the honor now to give the word to you, Martin. Martin, you are one of the shapers, you are one of the leaders, you're one of the key drivers of innovation in this country, and you're one of the most respected academians. The floor is yours, Martin.
Thank you very much, Mark, to make me blush for your very nice introduction. So I'm the guy between you and Mariana and Klaus, so I will try to be brief because people are expecting the rock stars. But it's a pleasure to be here, of course, to welcome you to EPFL campus, even though you are on Zoom. But let's pretend you are on campus of EPFL. That was the original plan. When we discussed digitalization in Switzerland this morning with a bunch of journalists in introduction of this very interesting digital competitiveness ranking, we came to the remarks that actually if one wanted to run a social science experiment on digitalization in a country, we would think about a real world experiment where we would really see if digitalization is up to snuff, etc. What we would do the COVID-19 pandemic exercise. And so what happened between March and late May in Switzerland was essentially a dry run, or more of a dry run actually, of a social science experiment to stress test an entire country, actually an entire world for that matter, but let's focus on Switzerland because that will be part of the discussion today, on how well we are prepared for digitalization. And there is some very good news and there is some not so good news, and I'll not spend too much time on the not so good news. Certain things were amazing. For example, Switzerland managed to develop a digital contact tracing application, which became sort of world leader and influenced Google and Apple to change their operating system so you could actually do digital contact tracing. Now, digital contact tracing is one of many elements you need to actually manage a pandemic. And so that's the good news. The bad news is that it's not so easy to have the general public install such an app. So we come to the question of trust, a topic where we have a center at EPFL, the Center for Digital Trust, because we think that in a dematerialized world, the question of trust is much more challenging than was maybe expected when the internet was invented. So all of this to say that Switzerland has some strengths and it has some weaknesses. And it was interesting to run the experiment. It's very interesting to see through the competitiveness ranking of IMD, and I thank Arturo Briz for this excellent work, to see all the dimensions where we can do better. And so that next year when we meet again, and after this event today, we can work hard and probably improve on the dimensions where there is still some work to be done. With this, I would like to hand over to the panel. The introduction will be done by Professor Arturo Briz of IMD. Over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Before I hand over to Arturo, I would like to quickly introduce Arturo, and I think you will have a movie for us, a short movie, Arturo. Martin said we explained the competitiveness report, which is one of the most relevant reports around digital competitiveness this morning to the media. And it was highly interesting to see also the journalists, which questions they had. But before we deep dive into that, maybe just to set the stage, the competitiveness of nation is probably one of the most significant developments in modern management, and IMD is really committed to leading this field. Now, you are, since January 2014, leading this world-renowned IMD Competitiveness Center. So the stage is yours. Please tell us about the brand new ranking.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and thank you especially Digital Switzerland for this opportunity and EPFL for our partnership. On behalf of the entire IMD World Competitiveness Center and IMD, I want to thank everybody for being here. As you can imagine, I'm a boring academic and I cannot explain things very well. On top of it, my daughter usually says that technology is wasted in adults. So better than me speaking about the rankings, we prefer to show you a video that spices up the results, that brings some result to action and to life, and I think that will be much more appealing for all of us. So let me play a video for you where we can see the results.
In one of the world's most volatile years, we analyzed 63 economies to determine this year's IMD Digital Competitiveness Ranking. For the third consecutive year, the United States came out on top. Singapore held the second spot, while Denmark overtook Sweden to claim third place. Hong Kong climbed 3 ranks to 5th, and Switzerland dropped 1 place to claim the 6th spot. In Switzerland, we see an economy that is really holding its own, outperforming many bigger ones. Its results in terms of talent are excellent, which only fits the digital technology skills in the country. Its favorable immigration process allows Switzerland's businesses to thrive as they attract the crème de la crème of international expertise. The regulatory framework in Switzerland greatly assists Swiss companies. From fintech to scientific research, a liberal, pro-business approach is the name of the game. Our future readiness criteria looks at how prepared a particular economy is. To measure it, we ask questions such as, how flexible are people in their attitudes towards adapting to new technologies? In this category, Switzerland is extremely strong in terms of its exchange of knowledge and information between academic institutions and the private sector. Switzerland's slight drop to 6th place this year is driven by declines in both knowledge and technology factors. In fact, over the last few years, the percentage of companies engaging in R&D in Switzerland has been falling. Switzerland also has to be mindful about continuing to attract a diverse workforce whilst encouraging homegrown talent. There is a balance to be struck, and this is not something the country can be complacent about. Looking at the technological framework indicator, Switzerland lost its footing this year, falling from 9th in 2019 to 14th. This was mainly due to a significant drop in tech exports. Indeed, exports in machinery, including computers, have dropped by some 8%, according to estimates coming out this month. Innovation should be at the heart of every economy. Yet, there is some inertia evident in Switzerland. Whilst other economies have leapfrogged to the next technological innovations with zeal, Switzerland has been more cautious. Cultural factors likely play a role. A certain fondness or tradition is clear. 5G did not come to Switzerland with the same speed as it did in South Korea, in China, or the United States, for instance. Apple Pay only arrived last month, and we're still waiting for Amazon.ch to make its appearance. E-participation has been an interesting one, and online voting is an example of how among Switzerland's different cantons, the status quo can vary. Taking overall, we continue to see great progress in Switzerland as a digital player, making a good progress and achieving major successes in key areas of digital competitiveness. Indeed, it is well positioned to challenge the world leaders in the digital arena.
Thank you, Arturo, for this short introduction. There will be now a panel discussion. I will just dive into that. And then there will be the possibility, of course, to ask questions and have a lively debate. But before I start, we heard from Arturo, Switzerland on position 6, down 1 point. There are 3 main criteria. First of all, knowledge. That's kind of a key criteria. In knowledge, Switzerland ranks 3rd. In future readiness, that's the 2nd criteria, Switzerland ranks 5th. And in technology, that's the 3rd criteria, Switzerland only ranks 11th. Now, let's go to our panel. I already quickly introduced you, Mariana. Mariana, your work is focused on the economics of innovation, the role of the state in modern capitalism, finance and economic growth, and how to steer innovation in a mission-oriented way directed at the sustainable development goals. And Klaus, our second guest on the panel, Klaus is one of the most successful investors, German, but living in Switzerland, Klaus, I think for 3 decades now, having just raised another fund, Lakestar, I can't remember which number, Klaus, you will tell us. It's roughly 700 million. And we will talk about competitiveness. We will talk about Europe. We will talk about what it takes to be successful. I welcome both of you, Mariana and Klaus. And I would like to start with the first question. I mentioned it, Klaus. For 3 decades now, you're living in Switzerland. Is Switzerland actually a good place to invest from?
Yeah, look, the first thing, thank you for reminding that's nearly 3 decades. These are the moments when you definitely notice you become old. Yeah, because for me, it felt as if I arrived here yesterday. So Switzerland is a fantastic place. And what we see is that with the Zooms of the world, the actual place where you are becomes a little bit more irrelevant, which means if you have the knowledge, have the money, you can drive, you can come to a beautiful Switzerland and from there drive the companies that you want to build. Yeah, you don't need to, and you can tap into talent from Eastern Europe and wherever in the world. This will be a way more dominant topic than we had it in the past, actually favoring Switzerland, I think. So I do believe that Switzerland has all the ingredients it needs to become a player. But I would say we just need a little bit more to focus on the strengths because it's way too difficult to fight the weaknesses.
That was a discussion we had today. I would like to just outline a couple of weaknesses, Klaus and Mariana. A couple of weaknesses within this ranking without being too long. Starting a business is rank 37. Now, let's not focus too much on the rankings, but they give you a really good idea still. Starting a business, weak. I will talk about IT and media stock market capitalization with you, Mariana, in a second. 43. Wireless broadband, 34. high-tech exports 30. So there's a couple of weak points, by the way, also women with degrees in the low 30s. Klaus, what are the strengths that you mentioned that Switzerland has?
Look, at the end, the talented people can make a choice for their life where they want to stay. Yeah, and you are, and at the end you still live. You are a social being, and being in Zurich or in Geneva or in Lausanne, wherever in Switzerland, is fantastic for your life, for your family. So, and if that is the focus, and you have all the ingredients, you can fly from everywhere, you have perfect infrastructure, then it is a perfect starting point. So work-life balance, or not to overstretch it, but you can really go all in from Switzerland and still have a way more equilibrated life.
Marianne, I would hand over to you now with kind of the core umbrella of the questions I will have for you. The role of the public sector. Now, you could say that actually the state is just a static bureaucratic organization, only needed to fix market failure. You see it different. Focused on Switzerland, where does the public sector actually take over? Or in examples you have experienced and written, described within your books, what's the role of the public sector and how can it actually drive innovation or make sure there's good fundamentals for innovation?
Right. So first of all, thank you. So I've written quite a bit about this in a book I wrote back in 2013 called The Entrepreneurial State. The point was not, the state is great, the state must do everything, the state must, as you just said, take over. That would not be good. That would stifle innovation. What you actually need is a strong direction. And the state, when it has been successful, and I'm thinking of both in the past, the moon landing, which we're celebrating the 50th anniversary this year or last year, the state was successful in actually directing a lot of effort to get to the moon and back, including lots of that in the private sector. There was Honeywell, General Electric, Motorola. It wasn't just NASA. There was lots of different sectors. It wasn't just aeronautics. To get to the moon, we required investment in innovation and nutrition, materials, electronics. The whole software industry actually emerged as a spillover from that mission. So the real question today is, what are the big problems we have that could, if you want, catalyze, galvanize, create additionality in a similar way? And the problems we have today are deeply social, which are much harder than the purely technological ones like going to the moon. A colleague of mine, wonderful colleague, Dick Nelson, wrote a book called The Moon and the Ghetto. How do we get to the moon and we still have ghettos? We still have deep inequality and other such social problems. And these social problems are much more wicked. They require regulatory change, political change, etc. But what the state has is a lot of levers that it can use in order to tilt the playing field towards a direction. And this word tilting the playing field is really important because it's not what we usually hear. We usually hear leveling the playing field. We're not going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by leveling the playing field. We're not going to achieve, a green transition or a Green Deal by leveling it. But tilting shouldn't mean picking, really kind of specific technologies and going after them, or specific types of firms to fund like SMEs, or specific types of sectors just to throw money at. The real question is, we need to pick the problems and then again, tilt the playing field in that direction. That means both tax policy, which is often dysfunctional. We are currently still taxing labor more than materials. We still have, in some cases, very low capital gains tax, for example, which rewards short-term trades instead of the long-run investments we need in all those different areas that your tracker actually looks at. But what I talk about in the entrepreneurial state is it requires lots of investment by both the private sector and the public sector across the whole innovation chain. Basic research, applied research, science industry linkages between them, patient long-term finance, but also the redesign of procurement policy, for example, which is a huge lever that governments have to act as the demand side pull. Because I see digitalization and AI as well, which is kind of connected to it as the new general purpose technology. And the previous general purpose technologies like electrification would not have caused economy-wide change without demand pull. So suburbanization, for example, was the demand side pull that allowed the mass production era in those technologies related to it to really affect economy-wide productivity and growth. What we need today are demand side policies around greening our economy, building better healthcare systems, the digital divide, to allow the digital technologies to actually have a funnel through which to really get, diffused throughout the economy.
We see like the most famous digital cluster still is the Silicon Valley. There's many others, but let's talk quickly about the Silicon Valley and check if the public space did a good job. Was that one of the key reasons that it actually all started in the Silicon Valley?
Well, there's lots of different factors, including some that had to do with very specific historical conditions, but everything that makes, our smart products smart and not stupid was actually an outcome of public investments in the US. It doesn't mean that Apple, the company was funded by the US government, but definitely what makes the iPhone, the iPad, all our iProducts smart. So internet, GPS, touchscreen, and Siri. And so all of those, by the way, came out of problem-solving organizations. So, DARPA, which funded the internet, what it was actually worried about was not the internet, that was just the solution. It was worried about getting the satellites to communicate. Similarly with GPS, which was funded by the Navy. And so again, I come back to this question, do we have the agencies? Do we have active, what I would call mission-oriented public agencies in nations like Switzerland or in Europe inside the Commission that can see through some of these missions? Because one thing is to talk about mission-oriented policies, another thing is actually to oversee them and to welcome the risk-taking and to have a proper kind of evaluation process, which includes when to turn the tap off. Anyway, that whole kind of intra-organizational issue, which means we need the right kind of dynamic capabilities of the public sector, unfortunately, they are often missing. Unfortunately, we have often in recent years outsourced those capabilities to, the big four consulting companies or other types of agencies. And that's a problem because then the public sector becomes a bit stupid. There's a wonderful concept in management literature called absorptive capacity. You actually need to be investing, for example, in research and development, even to understand what's around you. And in the early documentation, I've been reading this for a new book I'm writing, NASA was very clear in the 1960s that they had to continue to invest within their own kind of knowledge, brain in order to even know how to interact with the private sector. They were constantly contracting things to the private sector, but to even know how to write a contract, a term of reference, and to have a symbiotic, not a parasitic relationship, you need to know what you're talking about. You need to have real expertise. And that's the question, do we have that? And if not, it's very easy for state agencies to get captured.
Mission-oriented policies, Klaus Hommels, is, I think, a key statement and a key topic here. You have been very outspoken in the past couple of years around how you see Europe. By the way, in the US still having also a German passport, Germany, very strong economy, is ranked in the I think 18 or 19. Now, listening to Mariana, how do you see the role of the public sector within Europe? Or you might focus on Germany and Switzerland, but let's say like of the Central European countries. How do you see that?
So look, I think we entered, let me be really provocative. So the good thing at the Second World War was everybody knew when it started. Yeah, the Third World War probably has started and the Europeans have noticed it several years after the others had started it. So meaning we have seen in the US and in China, very, very stringent industry policy when it comes to the interest of their tech companies, and even that they basically create continental monopolies. So your US companies are not allowed to go into China, which allows the Chinese to become very big and very efficient in terms of marginal cost structures, and vice versa. So we are in between as a Southeast Asia. So The question is, how do we deal with it? So the state interferes massively in both areas, in both continents. And I think the answer is only state. So to give an idea, so if you want to protect yourself or get things going, you have two directions. Either you control via a cap table or you control via regulation. Europe, from the big platforms that exist worldwide, which are not listed, they raised, I think, something like 64 billion the last 8 years. Out of that, European money took part in 14% of the financing rounds. They invested 1.9% of the money and are represented with 1.4% in the cap tables. So I think that is an insolvency declaration for European participation in big tech companies, because if it comes to GDP or inhabitants, we should easily have 25% as a punchline. So having said that, the other flip side is regulation. So you need to regulate, because we do not have a choice. And it is important, and I never thought that I would be in favor of regulating, but it comes to our values. At some point, it may be more efficient, the system that you are detected crossing the street in China, and then if you do it against the law, you are directly debited with $5 at WeChat, but it's not what we want. So we cannot allow that others rape us with their technology or hitchhike democracy with their technology. So I do think we have core European elementary ethic values that we want to defend, and therefore the big players have to obey our ethic framework that we define for ourselves in Europe. So that's a governmental role. Yeah.
Interesting numbers. We have a couple of minutes left that I am moderating, and then Arturo will take over with questions from all of you. But let me just quickly give us an insight about how you actually work at the moment. So first question is, where and how did you raise the 750 million euro you had to raise for your newest fund? A. B, how are you going to invest the money?
Yeah, so I allow me a little bit longer for answer to the first part. Yeah, so we raised the money in minority in Europe. So we have Jack Ma, we have Li Ka-shing, we have Temasek, we have Mubadala, we have American pension funds. So it is very, very strange if you look at the numbers. So the German state invested in venture via the European Investment Fund, as the other states in Europe as well. And since 2005, they never occurred a loss. And in average, they made 12% yield after costs. On the same token, all the life insurers don't invest in venture, and they complain that they cannot hit the 2% minimum interest rate for the life insurance. So I do see a massive disconnect here. And if we want to reinvigorate the ecosystem, we need to get massive money into the market. Why? First, if we as European financiers cannot write the 50 or 100 million check, then we export the governance of this company because US or Chinese money will step in. One, if the next fantastic innovative idea needs 150 million until you can prove it, like a vaccination or something like that, and the entrepreneur knows in advance he wouldn't get the money in Europe, he wouldn't even start it in Europe. So these are very, very elementary questions where we need to think. We have enough money in Europe. It is a strength, but we have a regulation that basically, and a mentality and a cultural framework that basically inhibits this money to get into the system, which the state has to massively change. And historically, we were all good in Lenkungssteuern, meaning tax that are supposed to benefit certain canalization of money streams.
How are you going to invest the money?
So we try, and our mission is really to find European champions. There's a fantastic company in Switzerland. It's called Auterion. They are the only operating system for drones except DJI. And as you can imagine, since DJI is Chinese, we are the holy grail for the rest of the world if it comes to drones. And a typical situation, the US embraces that right away. So you have very easy business contacts and contracts with the US. And Europe is so slow in seeing this opportunity and doing and selling into European companies. So this is a local champion. Then we historically invested in payment systems like Klarnas and the SumUps, because the payment system is essential to our digital sovereignty in Europe. Imagine when we all leave here and we say, oh, this was a nice event with EMD and let's have a pizza. We pay with MasterCard, Visa or Amex. It's all American payment rails. If they flip the switch, we cannot pay consumer payments in Europe. Beside the fact that it has to yield nicely, which it normally does if you have a nice pick, we also have an emphasis on really trying to look for beneficial, system-relevant infrastructure that benefit the European digital sovereignty.
Mariana, let's talk quickly about the entrepreneurial spirit. Again, starting a business in Switzerland has historically been ranked low. Arturo, you will probably refer to that later. So we were never strong here. Now, can specific public policies help here, or what should be done that starting a business, which has different criteria, of course, funding, capital, access to capital, but also administrative frameworks, what can be done to make it more easier to Swiss entrepreneurs, because we are a knowledge country, to make it easier?
Right. I mean, I think the word easy is part of the problem. And I often say that I think we need to change the words. You know, some of the words that I don't like are, you know, government needs to de-risk business. Well, no, government has to take risks along the way as well. So we need to share risks and rewards, or making it easier. You know, this word like facilitating. It's just such a kind of boring and backseat lame word that if someone asks me, do you want to go facilitate Elon Musk or go work with Elon Musk? I'd rather go work with Elon Musk, right? So we need to actually describe the words that we're using for what we need from public sector institutions to be as ambitious as the same words we use for the private sector. That is, if, big if, they're actually going to co-create and co-shape markets together, as opposed to what I was saying before, it doesn't work, which is when you're always just in the fixing mode. You actually have to wait for the market to mess up and come in and put patches here and there by fixing market failures. So this co-creation agenda requires real kind of, as I was again saying before, knowledge and capabilities inside the public sector, but just what businesses then need is a proper partner. First of all, a partner that has those capabilities. They don't want one that doesn't have that absorptive capacity and knowledge to even understand the areas that we're talking about. But actually some businesses that are not so ambitious might prefer a stupid partner that simply increases their profits. So those businesses that just say, oh, just reduce my tax, or just give me a tax incentive, whether it's one around the patent box, which I don't have time to talk about, but it's not a very smart policy, or you know, an R&D tax credit. We have very little evidence that, for example, R&D tax credits, these are tax credits for research and development, actually create additionality if they're not also accompanied by direct government investments, which even just pave the way in the higher risk capital intensive areas. And then they crowd in the business sector, which then as icing on the cake might benefit from a tax incentive. But just focusing on indirect mechanisms historically just increases profits and not investment. And the goal of government should not be to increase profits, which by the way are at a record high globally in terms of the profit share of GDP, but investment, really kind of catalyzing business investment in new areas. And so I think the role of government to help business innovate, because that's what we're talking about. I don't think we're just talking about how can government help business just set something up that becomes kind of inertial and doesn't even create jobs, is not productive and is not innovative, right? So we want to create dynamic businesses. I think you need to do what I was talking about before, really focus on what big problems are that then can crowd in kind of business investment. You need to be making early stage investments before the risk averse private sector is willing to invest. We saw this in nanotech, we saw this in biotech, we saw this in the internet, we saw this in green tech. It was early stage public investments that paved the way when they were successful, when they weren't just crowding out existing private finance. You need to focus on the whole innovation chain and support those businesses, especially the small ones that need the support, but the small ones that are willing and able and daring to innovate. It's different from having SME policy. You need to focus on the kind of high growth, innovative companies that are even interested in change, and they will require, a patient long-term finance. In Israel, where people call Israel the startup nation, it wouldn't be the startup nation had there not been Yozma, a public venture capital fund. Most venture capital, and Klaus, I hope you agree that there's venture capital and there's venture capital. Some venture capital, which is almost more in the PE kind of mode, which is very exit driven and just wants to exit through an IPO or a buyout. If you look historically at that exit driven finance, if there hadn't been more patient finance coming before that, you wouldn't have had the whole biotech kind of, a sector actually emerging. And what we require, often even in the Death Valley phase, it's not 3 or 5 years, it's 10 or maybe 15 years. And some venture capitalists are willing to go for the long term, but that kind of short term exit-driven type of finance is especially problematic in science-based industries. And my friend Gary Pisano has written a great book called Science is Not a Business, but I also wrote quite a bit about this in my most recent book, The Value of Everything. So, and then again, even more downstream, if you think of not startups, but scaling up, helping startups scale up, what you see in places like Silicon Valley, which was the also the use of procurement, right? So in the UK, even where I live, the whole innovation budget of the government is about $10 billion. Just the procurement budget of the Ministry of Transport is 40 billion, sorry, not dollars, pounds, 40 billion pounds. So if we really transform procurement, just like NASA did, to crowd in bottom-up innovations, not top-down, that hurts innovation, bottom-up innovations, fuel that big problems, that can help actually that scaling up procedure. So I think what we lack in Europe is that kind of long-term patient finance. We lack ambitious procurement policy. And part of that in the US was mainly, but not only in the Department of Defense. It also went to the Department of Energy and the Department of Health. In the US, by the way, the large pharmaceutical companies benefit massively from $40 billion a year that the US government puts into health innovation. I think where the US has gone really wrong is that they've socialized the risks, but privatized the rewards. So they don't govern the patent system or the pricing system of the products they help to fund. They allow just the profits to go private. And then you have the state kind of, catching up and saying, oh dear, what are we going to do with all these people who can't afford that? And because they don't have a proper public healthcare system, they're in trouble. But even in Europe, we rely on the welfare state to cover that cost. So the taxpayer is really paying 2 or 3 different times and not getting their fair share of the risk that their tax money took.
Before I hand over to you, Artur, to gather and bring in the questions from all the leaders we have in the audience, Klaus, a couple of thoughts around the whole venture capitalist scene here. How much public money is out of the 750? How much of that money is actually public money?
I think it's less, let's say 6%. And that's all channeled via the European Investment Fund. But it's also, it's tricky because there's one implicit problem with it, because of course, since it's taxpayer money, it has a geo restriction. So, and if you do have a fund, sometimes these geo restrictions are a pretty hard burden. So the other question or the other problem that will occur is there's a lot of new money coming in. Germany is putting 10 billion into it with the Zukunftsfonds. And then they channel it through the existing ones, so KfW, KfW, EIF, or Coparion, and those institutions become more powerful. And everybody who becomes more powerful suddenly wants to pull the screws with all the different legislation or contracts, so that it becomes pretty, I fear it becomes pretty dysfunctional on that end.
Arturo.
Thank you. Since we promised our audience that we will finish in time, I will try to, there are many questions, and actually they're fantastic questions. So I'm going to ask at least one question to each of you, because I'm also very interested in the answer. Mariana, the first one is for you. So do you think that digitalization is something that can reduce inequalities? And if so, how?
So definitely, but if it's governed to do so, technology, there's, people who think that technology is going to solve your problem, as I mentioned this morning with the with our press meeting, you know, you don't understand technology and you don't understand your problems. So it will help solve inequality if we really, you know, again, direct our thinking around specific problems that it might help with. So the digital divide is the most obvious, as you know, with the lockdown experience. Many young people are not being educated in the same way, depending on their social and economic backgrounds. But also, you know, there's a wonderful letter. It's in a wonderful book called Letters of Note, where the head of NASA back in some time ago was written a letter by a nun who said, why are you wasting all this money up there when there's all these problems on Earth of poverty, of hunger? And he wrote a beautiful letter in reply where he agreed with her that, yes, of course, we must be thinking about the problems on Earth. But then he listed all the amazing ways in which kind of blue sky research and research that was actually going after, you know, space exploration, but also other types of basic research, and the effects they actually had on very earthly problems of poverty, of, you know, medicine being made available to a much wider group than the narrow group that it used to be made available to. So these spillover effects are very important. However, we have to govern those spillover effects. And that's what I meant before when I said we must govern, for example, intellectual property rights. They have actually been abused in many ways in many different sectors. Patents are too wide, they're too strong, so hard to license, and they're too upstream in the innovation chain. So the tools for research are being privatized. That doesn't help innovation, and that doesn't help inequality, because it doesn't allow science actually to reach and to be fully diffused even once the patent is up.
Klaus, this one is for you, and I think you hinted to some of the issues here, but why don't we have a digital champion in Switzerland or in Europe? We don't have Alibaba or we don't have Alphabet. What are the reasons? And what is more important, what would you do about it?
Look, also, if some might say, look, that's a simplistic view, Klaus. But if you look at every company that has made it to a stock exchange has received in average $350 million funding. Every company which is out of the big ones that we admire has at least gotten the obvious financing of 2, 3, 4 billion. So, and so far we try to put 10 million in and say, look, we build a global leader. That doesn't work that way. So, and so there has to be a movement in sync that we have more courageous founders, which we clearly have now. Yeah, more willingness to put serious money at work, more openness from businesses as we move to the B2B sector.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I need to leave. They're waiting for me on another panel. So I just wanted to
go ahead, Mariana. Thank you for being with us.
And kisses to you all, Italian style.
Go ahead, Klaus.
Yeah, so, and openness of businesses, because we do a lot of B2B businesses now, to work with startups. Because if we do not work with startups in the incumbents don't learn, and the startups do not get it to scale. So this is absolute critical that this will that will be solved and will be more embraced, this kind of system.
Arturo, one more question to Klaus.
So I think we can take it back to you, because some of the questions have already been answered. I think the discussion was very interesting. There are questions, for example, about partnerships. There are questions about capital, and I think that the questions that remain are much more about the rankings. But I don't want to answer that because rankings are boring. So
with that, let me hand it over to Jean-François Manzoni, who is going to do the wrap up of this intense high-end debate we have here. Jean-François is, of course, the president of IMD, and IMD is the roof for this wonderful competitiveness ranking that we have been talking about today during the whole day. Jean-François, please close with your final remarks, with your wrap up this third competitiveness summit, please.
Thank you, Mark. And let me start by saying that I'm very conscious that with my Canadian and my French passport, I speak as a guest in Switzerland. And generally good form for guests not to criticize the host cooking. But I also speak as the CEO of an organization that works all over the world and is, as a result, exposed to the approaches used in different countries. And then, of course, we have the World Competitiveness Center headed by Arturo, that was created to study these approaches systematically and to understand their positive and their negative impacts. The Swiss system, including for a foreigner, is a fascinating one. So, a federal system with a great deal of decentralization, resulting in great local anchoring, as well as a fair amount of duplication, and also multiple parties requiring consultation and cooperation. Now, it's a system that is often described as potentially slow, but it has been fascinating for me to watch how the system reacted in the COVID crisis. I think what the Swiss system showed is that it is actually a system that can react remarkably effectively and efficiently in a crisis. Unfortunately, the fourth industrial revolution or the digital revolution has not been labeled an official crisis. It's a priority for most, it's a threat for some, and an opportunity for others, but it is not an official crisis benefiting from a very focused and concerted effort. And so we're to some extent back in a decentralized system that's not necessarily as deliberate and forceful as others. And Klaus and Mariana have referred to that aspect. So in this context, organizations like Digital Switzerland are very necessary mechanisms to supplement government's efforts on a number of fronts. One of them is of course, to foster a tighter and a faster coordination between relevant actors, including by encouraging exchange of good practices, but also by giving a stronger and a more aligned voice toward government and policymakers. I think that policymakers and politicians are facing real challenges convincing citizens of the benefit of some of the key decisions that need to be made. And organizations like Digital Switzerland and their members can help to develop ideas, arguments, and a coalition of parties to help promote effective avenues and to help policymakers to secure buy-in from citizens for these effective avenues. We at IMD are thrilled to be part of Digital Switzerland. We've been very happy to be co-organizing this digital summit, I think now for the third time. And some of the thoughts that I think we need to keep in mind is that this digital revolution will happen. The questions are, at what speed? At what speed around the world and at what speed in Switzerland? Organizations and countries are involved in a relentless race, and we observe more and more winner-take-all sort of outcomes. So speed has become an increasingly critical dimension. Two, how will the benefits be shared between the various stakeholders, individuals and organizations, labor and capital? Who will capture the value being created? Right now, arguably, capital and organizations are capturing a lot of the value. And finally, what trade-offs between individual and societal goals will we have to make along the way? Some of our individual aspiration and reservations, especially in Europe, may be getting in the way of collective progress and speed. And that's potentially very costly in a winner-take-all race. Of course, then again, the economic system is not meant to be an end in itself. It's a way to organize interactions between humans and to enable life in society. So the goal ought to be to create a prosperous, fair, and sustainable society. So again, this discussion was intense, it was rich, it raised a number of questions and avenues. And clearly, I'm not going to summarize these avenues, but hopefully will encourage all of us to continue to discuss and to continue to encourage leaders and also policymakers to make some of the tough and courageous decisions that are probably needed in order to, again, ensure that Switzerland and Swiss organizations remain very much at the forefront of a world that is evolving extremely rapidly.
Jean-François, thank you very much. Thank you, Klaus Hommels. Thank you, Martin Vetterli, for everything you have done, you personally, with EPFL, etc., for the next steps of our wonderful country. Thank you, Arturo, for this wonderful report and for participating throughout the whole day. And thank you, dear colleagues, having followed this third Digital Competitiveness Summit. Stay healthy. Thank you for participating. Bye.